everyone, I'm Chris O'Neill from Sew the Distance. Thank you for joining me as we explore yet another old quilt in this episode of Lessons from an Old Quilt. This particular quilt is a little unique because it's not actually from my collection. It is a quilt that belongs to my father. However, I did purchase this quilt for my father about 15 years ago. So let's back up a little bit. My dad is a great guy, and he loves anything Civil War. He watches any type of movie or documentary, reads all the books, drives my mother crazy, but he loves the Civil War. So about 15 years ago, I was at the Brimfield Flea Market in Massachusetts, and I came across this quilt, and the vendor had told me that it was a Civil War quilt, and I thought of my dad immediately. So I purchased it for him, and I think I gave it to him for his birthday. Fast forward to our move to Pennsylvania, and my dad said to me, "When are you gonna look at my quilt?" And I didn't even remember I purchased it for him, and I couldn't even have told you what it looked like. So he went and got it for me, and when I looked at it, I thought, well, I don't know for sure if it's Civil War, but it's a pretty old quilt. So anyway, I told him I would do that. I would look at this quilt and examine it for him on camera for YouTube and for him and all the world to see. So let's take a closer look at this quilt, and we'll talk about what I think the age is. I might have been taken a little bit at Brimfield, but maybe not as much as I thought originally. Okay, let's take a good look at this quilt. Okay, so let's start by looking at the block itself. And we can see that right here. And this particular layout of this block is called sunshine and shadow. So we see the light part over here, which would be representing the sunshine, and the shadow, which is here, which is the dark fabrics. And if you look at this block, you can see it's made up of a center, which is about 3 inches, a 3-inch square, and it has the logs going around the outside. Now, just like our quilt from, I think it was last week, we see this was foundation piece. Now, how do I know that? I know that because I peeked inside, because there's quite a few holes in this particular quilt. So the maker put this on a foundation and then stitched and flipped this piece, and then this piece, and then this piece, and then this piece, and kept going all the way around to make this pattern. Probably drew some lines or somehow made sure that these were cut perfectly to stitch and flip. And hopefully I'll have a video out on how to exactly do that, because it is a really cool method, and it's a great method for anybody wanting to do a log cabin quilt. So this particular block is throughout, and all the maker did was turn the orientation. So the blocks were made and then put together, and you can see it was turned. So, and that's the way all log cabins usually are. The color plays a really strong role because you have this huge contrast, and then you can make some really cool variations. If you get a minute, just Google variations of log cabin quilts, and you'll see the layouts and how many different things you can do with this. So traditionally, the center is either red, which represents a fire or the hearth of the home, or they're yellow, which represents a light in the home. This fabric may have, and I'm sure it has, aged over the years. It could have been red at one point and turned into this really wonderful purple that has a neat patina. We really aren't sure, but when I talk to friends of mine who are much more knowledgeable about fabric, antique fabrics, they all seem to agree that that was at one point a red fabric. The next thing I want you to notice is the quilting. And you can see the teeny tiny stitches that are hand quilted. Oh, and by the way, it was hand pieced as well on a foundation. But these small stitches aren't in everything, but are in a lot of things. And so it doesn't go diagonally throughout, but definitely in the middle it does. And I love that, because I tend to, if I looked at this block, if I made something like this, I would want to stitch and keep with the logs and maybe do some squares or some other geometric shapes. This maker went with the diagonal, and I like it because it's a cute little motif in the middle, and that stitching really shows up, which is really neat. Another thing I want to show you is the borders, because I think this is a really clever way that the maker made these borders. So you can see, so the block ends here. All right, I'll put it inside the block. The maker continued to use the same color, same fabrics, and the same lights and darks and play with that color even into the borders, which is really neat because it extends that overall pattern, and it's almost like the whole quilt, once the blocks were put together, became a log cabin. Okay, and again, we see that stitching again here in the borders that extends. It's a little bit bigger than the crosshatch in the center blocks. It's a little bit of a bigger distance between them, but that pattern is continued, and I think that was a really smart move too. It just shows the talent and the design and the care that went into this entire quilt. It is, as far as condition, it's not great. We can see there are a lot of holes, a lot of tears in this, but overall, considering its age, it's in pretty good shape. Now, was I taken when by the vendor in at Brimfield? You know, maybe the vendor thought that he was selling me a Civil War quilt. It is definitely that era. However, we don't believe it is actually from the Civil War. A lot of the quilts did not survive the Civil War. So, but it is from that time period. So I guess that's neat too. Let's look at the back. Now it's very brittle, so I'm trying to be very careful with this quilt. We can see that the backing was pieced, of course, I'm sure because of the fabric availability overall. And there are some holes, which allows us to peek in and see this cotton batting. It's a very thin batting, and but overall it's held up pretty well. The binding is in rough shape, but the good news is somebody didn't try to replace it and maybe change the value that way. So when you're making one of these, playing with the sizes is another great way to change the look of this. So if this middle would have been smaller or even larger, it would have changed the entire look of the overall quilt and the overall layout, depending on how you wanted to lay out your blocks and what the sizes of each are, you know, so you can really play with that. So as a maker, we want to make sure that we think about those things, especially when we're making a cool quilt like this, and just, you know, have some fun with it. This is a wonderful pattern for a beginner, and it's a great pattern that gives us a world of possibilities of layouts and design, and allows us to really play with the lights and the darks and the fabrics and have a really good time while making wonderful masterpieces just like this one. Just like every week, we can learn so much from this quilt too, right? So I think the first thing that we can learn from the maker is to continue the block pattern into the border. And so when we're making quilts, think of that border sometimes as an extension of the block. And we see that here. We see where the maker actually took those fabrics that were in the blocks. Maybe the maker just had them and had very limited supplies. That's probably the case, but still it was smart the way the maker laid out the colorways of this, mimicking that sunshine and shadow that we see in the actual block. I think that's really smart, and it's something we can learn and think about when we're adding borders to our own quilts. The next thing we can learn from this quilt has to do with the quilting. When we look at these blocks, or at least when I look at these blocks and I see that crosshatch design in the center of the blocks, I automatically think of like a mini quilt hanging in that log cabin somewhere in the woods. And I know that might sound silly, but that's what I think of. I love that. I love that the maker used the crosshatch diagonal pattern. I think as makers, we tend to want to follow that block and do squares all over a log cabin quilt, or at least I do. That's my first go-to pattern I would quilt on this quilt. But I think that keeping it still geometrical with the diagonals, but not mimicking the actual blocks, it was a really, really smart idea and a smart way to quilt this quilt. quilt. And finally, the last thing that I believe we can learn from this maker is to play with the sizes of the centers of these blocks. We see log cabin variations where the centers are teeny tiny, and we see them where they're giant, and we see everything in between. And this maker did a 3-inch center and 3/4 inch logs around that hearth or the center of the block. And I think that's really cool. It accentuated that middle yet again, just like the quilting accentuated it, making it larger, which I know was traditional at the time, but still making that larger really accentuated that center and made it really cool too. As always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your support. Please consider subscribing if you haven't done so. And if you have, thank you so much. It just helps support this channel. I can't tell you how grateful I am to all of you. I will see you next week for yet another Lessons from an Old Quilt. And I will see you later this week for a vlog. And hopefully somewhere in there, there's going to be a few tutorials mixed in too. I'm trying to stay on a schedule to get some tutorials out to you. But anyway, again, thank you so much. Have a great week. Stay safe, stay warm. I'm thinking of everybody in these areas, especially Texas. Oh, it's just been an incredible winter here and an incredible year, hasn't it? So please just know I'm thinking of you and praying for you, and I will see you next time. Bye.